Alright guys, let's try and get this over with as quick as you can this morning. You guys are all tired, so we'll go through this as quick as we can. We're going to do our presentation on the history of the NHL. We believe it's important for our generation to be aware of the history. As you're watching, you can't truly appreciate the game if you don't know the background to it. And there was a lot of events and situations that made the NHL what it is today. So with that, I'll pass it to Johnny here.
Jonathan Warner. And first thing I'll say a couple quotes from the late great Fred Shero, who was a player, coach, and GM in the NHL. We know that hockey is where we live, where we can best meet and overcome pain, wrong, and death. Life is just a place to spend time before games. This next quote I like a little bit more. Win today, and we walk together forever. These quotes really mean a lot to the history of the game, because it shows how much of a rich past it has that most people overlook. Well, I'm here today to give you a history lesson. Hockey can be traced back and originated to Holland in the 17th century. But as you know, they played on ice, but did not use skates. The origins of modern ice hockey was established in the late 1800s in Canada. The sport was especially popular among university students in Ontario. In fact, the very first amateur hockey league was from Kingston, Ontario, which only consisted of 4 teams. But during this time, English Governor General of Canada, Lord Stanley of Preston, who had sons that were avid hockey players, convinced their father to donate a silver bowl that was awarded to the winning amateur team. And thus the Stanley Cup actually predated the NHL. The Stanley Cup helped drive the Canadian interest in hockey, and the Canadians seemed to be more content to compete for the cup. World War I had a big impact on hockey, but it disrupted the early play in the NHL. The team representing the 228th Battalion of the Canadian Army was sent overseas. This left 5 teams in the league, which resulted in an unbalanced schedule. To fix this problem in the league, they tried to get rid of Eddie Livingston, an unpopular head of the Toronto franchise. The owners of the league hoped to drop the Toronto team and distribute the players. In the end, however, they adopted a simpler solution. They formed a new league, and on November 22nd, 1917, the NHL was born. The first American-based NHL franchise was the Boston Bruins. They began playing in 1924, but the following year the Hamilton team was relocated to New York, where they were renamed the Americans. And they rented out the Madison Square Gardens for their games. The owners of Madison Square Gardens were so impressed by the popularity of the team that they purchased their own franchise and named them the Rangers. By the end of the 1920s, there were 10 teams in NHL. 6 were playing out of the United States. So to accommodate the large crowds necessary to support the growing NHL, the country saw a golden opportunity to build rinks. In addition to Madison Square Garden, several other storied arenas were built. The Montreal Forum, Boston Gardens, Detroit Olympia Stadium, Chicago Stadium, and in 1931, the Toronto Maple Leafs Garden. The NHL became very popular on the radio at the time too. A news reporter named Foster Hewitt began to do a radio broadcast of Toronto games, and in 1933, a network of 20 Canadian stations created to broadcast NHL games on Saturday nights. By the end of the season, there were more than 30 stations broadcasting in the hockey games. An estimated 72% of all radios in Canada were tuned into the games weekly.
Alright, so I'm going to talk about the original 6 a little bit here. The original 6 should be familiar with most of you. I'm sure you've all heard of it if you watch NHL. It was the first 6 teams to ever belong in the NHL, and is why these teams have such fierce rivalries today. The original 6 lasted from 1942 to 1967, and it consisted of the Montreal Canadiens, New York Rangers, Boston Bruins, Detroit Red Wings, Chicago Blackhawks, and the Toronto Maple Leafs. Back then, it's really hard for players to crack into the league. I mean, I know today it's still hard, but back then you can't even imagine how hard it was because there was only 6 teams. There were only about 100 players who had steady jobs in the league, and being that there was only 6 teams and no farm teams or minor league teams, there were not a lot of roster spots available, and being a goaltender was especially hard to make it in the NHL. Educators had a big problem with the NHL at the time. They didn't really believe that it was going to evolve into anything, and they thought that the kids were being lured into the NHL without any education to back up on because they gave up on their studies. So the prospecting was really important to the teams though, and they did everything they could to try and fill up their minor pro teams and really just get as much talent as they could in there. Okay, so next is the expansion era. It ran from, well, the first expansion era ran from 1966 to 1992. Anything you'd like to add here, John, before
Yeah, like as Andrew said, I guess it was really tough to make it into the NHL. There's only 6 teams. Well, the demand for great players and the need for education.
All right.
Can I add something in here?
Yeah.
I think that is an all-out total, at the least argument, at the most war between educators looking at athletes. We're real mean. We don't seem to respect. We really need to work hard to help people do it all. And some of us are really crabby about that, aren't we? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
After the original 6 era came the expansion era, and in 1963, the Rangers governor William Jennings extended the idea of adding 2 teams from the American West Coast for the 1964-65 season. The idea really took off, and every meeting that the governors got together, they were talking about this topic and everything. And by 1966, there had been 6 teams added to the NHL. Those teams were Los Angeles, Minnesota, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Oakland, and St. Louis. In 1970, the Vancouver Canucks and the Buffalo Sabres were welcomed to the NHL with open arms. The first real adversity that the NHL faced came in 1972 from the World Hockey Association. They were really similar to what the KHL and the NHL are battling against right now. The WHA was willing to offer the NHL players larger contracts, and they managed to sway about 67 players over to their league instead. One of the biggest ones was probably Bobby Hull, who signed a $2.75 million contract. I wasn't sure on the years on that one, but still a lot of money. The WHA folded in 1978, and the NHL really flourished, and they managed to bring the total to 21 teams, which ran all the way until 1991. The Southward expansion ran from 92 to 2000. Gary Bettman came up with a plan that they wanted to double their revenue to $400 million and bring the league to 28 teams. And new teams were quickly joining the league, and this plan worked for the most part. And by 1993, there were 26 teams, with the additions of San Jose, Ottawa, Tampa Bay, Anaheim, Florida, and Minnesota moved to Dallas that year and became the Dallas Stars. Yeah, I'm just going to go back to the original 6 a little bit here. James Norris, he was the owner of the Detroit Red Wings, and he had great influence over the Bruins, Blackhawks, and Rangers. He led part of the group that owned the New York Rangers and the Madison Square Garden. And he really didn't give any other team a chance other than he kind of stacked up Detroit and didn't really care about Chicago or any of the other teams. And the Blackhawks, from 1944 to 1952, made the playoffs only once. And Rangers actually started from 1949 to 1957. So in 8 years, they only made the playoffs once. Norris was the largest stockholder for the Rangers, and he also helped out the Bruins. After the Great Depression, the Canadian dollar was sinking, and Boston only had 4 winning seasons from 1947 to 1967. So those were tough times for Bruins fans. Glad I wasn't around back then. Critics joke that the NHL actually stood for the Norris House League. And another reason why, Montreal and Toronto were the 2 most successful in this era because the 50-mile radius signing rule. So all of the talent was really coming out of Ontario and Quebec. And the American teams like Chicago and Boston and the Rangers, they couldn't sign any of these players because they were over 50 miles. So Montreal and Toronto were really catching it on that.
Who's got the laptop up over there? Who wants to die? 10% just knocked right off their mark.
And they'd already failed.
Before I talk about the 1994 lockout, just like to talk about, I don't know if anybody's heard of Bill Masterton before. There's a trophy for some people probably. Yeah, one of the major rule changes occurred in 1979. In 1968, Bill Masterton was hit so hard that he flipped over and landed on his head. He was immediately rushed to the hospital and died 2 days later. Immediately, there's a trophy that came up for him, and players were slowly starting to adopt the idea of putting on helmets. And by 1979, they were mandatory. That's one of the events that happened back then that really shaped the game today. Talk about the 1994 lockout. Due to the lack of a new collective bargaining agreement, the NHL had a lockout that lasted 104 games. Games were cut from 84 to 48, and it really hurt hockey back then, but they managed to get through, obviously. A deal was reached, however, the fall of the Canadian dollar forced the Quebec Nordiques to relocate and become the Colorado Avalanche in 95. The Winnipeg Jets followed the next year and became the Phoenix Coyotes. In 1997, the Hartford Whalers became the Carolina Hurricanes. In 1998, the Nashville Predators joined the NHL, and were followed a year later by the Thrashers of Atlanta. And the total was brought to 30 with the re-addition of Minnesota Wild and the new addition of Columbus Blue Jackets. And that was later. And that's all we have for today. Yeah, that's it.